working? Cool. Good morning. Welcome to our 2020 National Journal Member Summit. Thank you all for being with us first thing in the morning. I am still waking up. I have a 2-month-old at home, and we had a fun night last night, so I'm excited to join you all as well. Just a couple housekeeping items before we get the program started. One is when you walked in, you were handed a packet. In that packet actually is an example, and I would call it a prototype of our latest product launch that we'll be launching throughout 2020. We're hiring an entirely new analyst staff. I think we've hired about 6 to 8 folks so far that are going to be building detailed profiles on every public policy professional and influencer in the country. So when we get to the end of this, it'll be about 40,000 profiles of government officials, folks like yourself, as well as folks that are in the states that are working on public policy. So we're really excited about that. If you have any questions about it or want to ask for more details, you certainly can get that from your dedicated advisors who are here today. And certainly, as you all probably know very well, we'll be in touch throughout the year. Now getting to the program, really excited about today and really setting the stage on 2020. I think that's probably the central focus of almost all of us in the room. And we'll start today with a brief from our Senior Vice President of Product Strategy and Consulting, Luke Hartig, who's going to walk us through the campaign staffs. Who's on the campaign staffs? What are their expertise? Where may they be moving the candidates when it comes to policy positions? So really excited for Luke's brief. And then after Luke, we'll take 10 to 15 minute break, and then we'll have Charlie come up and do what Charlie does best. So with that said, Luke.
Well, thanks so much, Kevin, for the warm intro, and thanks everybody for being here today. See some familiar faces in the crowd and really excited to talk about some of our work. So as Kevin said, I run a couple of businesses at National Journal that focus on doing people research. And today we'll talk about the people, the networks, the funders, everybody who's around the 2020 Democratic candidates to give you a feel of how you can prepare for the election, how you might think about influencing the campaigns, and maybe a little bit of a crystal ball on where things might actually come out. I run 2 different businesses at National Journal. One, the people product business that Kevin just mentioned, these deep people profiles. Let's see if I can advance the slides. Sorry. Should I point it somewhere, guys? All right. I'll riff for a minute while we figure this out. So I run 2 businesses at National Journal, and the core of both these businesses is doing deep research on people and organizations, the most influential people and organizations, how they're driving public policy issues, how they're connected to one another. Perfect. There we go. There's the slides. And we do coverage of a wide range of issues, everything from tax reform, random small kind of arcane taxes that are only relevant to your particular industry, Medicare, state and local issues, complex government contracting issues, you name it. If it's something that you're probably spending your time on, we've probably covered it in some way or another. So the work tends to be very custom, very relevant to your particular strategy. But one thing we've found is a unifying theme for all of our clients, aside from tax reform, that was a unifying theme. But the other thing we found is a consistently unifying theme is the elections, and particularly the presidential elections. So we've been doing this work for about 9 months or so now, mapping the networks around the candidates. We initially started with, I think, 10 candidates. Today we'll just talk about the top 6 in the race based off of most recent polling and kind of, I think, who people expect will still be at the top of things at the end of the day. We started doing this type of analysis of the elections back in 2016. And in 2016, which was also the year that we lost, we were kind of like a lot of new businesses, right? We had a series of good early wins. We had more than our fair share of early losses. We're trying to kind of build our momentum. And it turned out that that momentum came in the form of Donald J. Trump. And what I mean by that was we can debate his overall economic performance among players in this room, but for us at the National Journal, he was most definitely a job creator. We had so many people who came to us after President Trump won election and said, who are all these people around him? He was bringing in all these unconventional voices. Where are they coming from? Where does he get his influence? Who's going to fill the key positions in his administration? Now, this race is very different. There's probably no Trump in the Democratic side of things in this particular race. But I do think that some of the dynamics around the Democratic race right now are more uncertain than they've been at any time in history. And so for that reason, I think understanding the people around them is highly important. A few things jump out for me. The progressive bloc is more diverse than it's ever been. The traditional power centers of the progressive bloc don't hold the same influence that they used to. You have upstarts like Bernie and all of the kind of progressive candidates around him that he's brought along. You have a huge amount of grassroots activism, everything from the Sunrise Movement to Black Lives Matter and kind of everything in between. You've got the centrists who arguably powered Democrats into regaining control of the Congress in 2018. It's a diverse space. And each one of the candidates we're going to talk about today, I think, taps into a different part of that and has a different base from which they're speaking. So let me just talk to you a little bit about how we started this research and give you a little bit of our kind of methods laid down. And bear with me here, but I think this is important to kind of understand the basis of how we think about understanding the candidates. So first of all, when we set out to look at the candidates, we look at their networks holistically speaking, right? We look at if they're currently in office, we look at their staff. If they were formerly in office, we look at their staff. We look at the campaign staff. We look at family and personal networks, friends, colleagues, former college roommates, anything that we can come up with that indicates who are the people who are really influential around them. And we take a broad look at their donor network. All of this starts with kind of the basic supposition that people and organizations really matter, that the connections at an interpersonal level really, really matter, and that whoever wins the nomination is most likely, although not a certainty given President Trump, there's always a Trump asterisk because he blew up the playbook in so many ways, but most likely they're going to be tapping some of the leaders from some of the most important institutions on the progressive side of things. So when we think about what are those essential networks and what is kind of like the pathway to the nomination, we think about it as kind of what we call 6 essential campaign networks. Democratic establishment, for us, those are the typical ones like the DCCC, DSCC, DNC, state Democratic parties, also the previous 2 Democratic candidates, so Hillary for America, Obama for America. It's the primary ground game, and that's a little bit of overlap there, but who are the people they're putting on the ground in the states? Are they building a really quality ground team there? Progressive advocates, this can be kind of traditional progressive advocates, your traditional mainstream environmentalist groups like NRDC and others. It can also be some of the more populist and progressive groups that I talked about at the outset. Policy advisors, who are those wonks? Who are the people who are really driving their ideas, their thinking? These people in some sense are less important for winning the nomination, but are definitely more important when you're thinking about who might be the core of a future administration should a Democrat win this year. And finally, industry, of course, as everybody's tracking in our current environment and given the jobs that you all do every day, this is a bit of a double-edged sword in our current environment. Nobody wants to go out and say they're sort of the Democratic candidate of big business, but nonetheless, having the support of some of our more successful people in the business sector, having their financial support in particular is extremely important. So we still think it's an important network to watch. One thing I would just say at the outset here is that everything you're seeing here is available in your deck. So I know that sometimes these slides can be a little bit small, but feel free to follow along your deck if you'd like to. This is just a quick overview of the way we've broken down every single candidate. You'll find these overview slides at the back of your deck that has each of the candidates in the middle and how we rank them on the range of different factors around them. But let me jump into and give you kind of a peek under the hood of what we do, right? So bear with me. I know these slides can be a lot if you haven't seen them already, but this is the entirety of the networks that we've mapped around the 2020 candidates. There are several thousand people and organizations in here that are connected in some way, in some relevant way to the candidates. A couple of key takeaways from this slide, and then we'll jump into some of the more specifics about the candidates. So first of all, if you look at this slide, the one thing to understand is that it's all about a race for talent, and particularly a race for early electoral talent. That big cluster in the middle there, that is all of the people who powered President Obama to victory, who supported Hillary Clinton's campaign. And if you look at the people who are competing most aggressively for that talent, it's been Buttigieg, it's been Warren, and it's been Biden. Warren, perhaps a little bit surprising, but it's something she did very early on, which is to realize that winning over some of that key establishment ground game was going to be essential to her overall strategy. The three candidates you see on the edge have their own reasons for being on the edge. You got Bernie in the upper left corner. The reason he's in the upper left corner is because, well, I mean, he's mostly had a network of people who are very insular, who are tightly bundled around him and don't have any interest in being part of the Democratic establishment back at the middle there. You have Klobuchar off to the right. A lot of that is because her early campaign was really built around state-level operatives, particularly those who've operated in the upper Midwest, people who powered her victories in Minnesota, some key players from Iowa, but less of the kind of the national-level political professionals. And in the bottom, you have Bloomberg, perhaps no surprise there, late entrant to the race, former Republican mayor, businessman, very much outside of the Democratic mainstream to begin with, and also came in very late, so a lot of the talent he might have otherwise hired had already been snatched up by other candidates. That's changed a little bit as he's hired some people from some of the candidates who dropped out. But for now, that's kind of the state of the race as we see it from the big network perspective. But what does it actually mean, right? If some of our clients look at that, look at those big network maps and are like, that's just fascinating. I love all this data. Other clients are like, you know what, just get me to the actual insights. So won't judge you either way, depending where you come out there. But here's kind of a heat map of how we see the different candidates breaking out. And we'll go into each of these in greater detail, so I won't spend a lot of time on this slide. I think the big thing for us as a takeaway here is that when we first started mapping their strengths across these respective parts of the Democratic bloc, what we found was there was huge disparities. At this point, most of those disparities have decreased. Each candidate, to be sure, has their own strengths and weaknesses, but for the most part, there's not a huge gap in kind of the capabilities and the relationships of one candidate with one sector versus another. Maybe the only exception to that is that Amy Klobuchar's campaign is still, from a pure network basis, probably less robust than some of her competitors. So let me jump into kind of walking through what each one of those different parts of the block looks like and how they've come up. And I'll just explain some of the key points here. But I think the one thing that jumps out for me kind of right out of the beginning of this is that, again, is everybody's competing for that block of Democratic establishment, campaign operatives, pollsters, consultants, et cetera. Elizabeth Warren, despite her kind of progressive reputation, actually went in quite early and hired up a number of Hillary alums, of others who kind of come from that Democratic establishment and seem to be doing that to really shore up some of her credentials. I would say her strongest early competition for those Hillary people was Kamala Harris. Now that Senator Harris has dropped out, some of those people have gone to various places, including to Bloomberg, some back to places like the DCCC, but Warren really made an early bid for that. When you look at the Obama alums, it's pretty evenly split between Vice President Biden and Mayor Pete Buttigieg. Obviously, different parts of the demographic there. Biden has a lot of the older and more experienced parts of that Obama machine. Buttigieg has more of the youngsters in that camp, but they're the two who've been the beneficiaries of that world. If you look at Sanders, he is very much outside that Democratic establishment for reasons I just discussed. Bloomberg as well. When you look at the Bloomberg campaign and the people he's brought on, they have been from a few key camps. They're people he worked with in the mayor's office. They're people he's worked with in industry, people he's worked with at his philanthropies, and to a lesser extent, some of the campaign operatives he's hired away from two candidates who dropped out, Kamala Harris as well as Steve Bullock. So when you're thinking about where he's building up some of his strength, it's probably from those two camps most notably. One side note here, and I think an interesting dynamic in this race, and again, something that I think people in this room, given the amount of time you've probably spent over the last couple of years engaged in state and local battles, is the extent to which Bloomberg and Buttigieg in particular are trying to leverage those connections they have at the local level to particular mayors who might come out and support them and point to their records of success at the local level. So for Mayor Pete, very early on, he locked up a lot of that support from mayors across the country. Mayor Bloomberg, in coming in, has also brought a lot of that power to bear, although for him, him, a lot of it comes from the mayors he worked with when he's been working on kind of what's the post-Paris response in the absence of the administration being involved in the Paris climate deal. The early states, what everybody's focusing on right now, less than a week to Iowa. How are they shaping up in this particular space? Well, in Iowa, if you just look at purely the strength of the campaign organizations, the three strongest that we've really pulled out are Warren, Sanders, and Klobuchar. Warren has probably the strongest overlap with the Iowa Democratic Party of any other candidate. Incidentally, also very strong with the Pennsylvania Democratic Party. Bernie's staff largely matches and mirrors his national level profile. That's to say he has a lot of activists from the progressive space. Two that we've highlighted here is local organizers from Planned Parenthood and League of United Latin American Citizens. Klobuchar, again, building a lot on those kind of deep upper Midwest roots, a lot of Minneapolis or Minnesota campaign operatives as well as longtime Iowa campaign operatives. If you look at New Hampshire, Bernie trying to pull off the victory he had there 4 years ago, doubling down with support from a lot of the local officials who supported his campaign then or supporting his campaign now. I think it's going to be a tougher road for him this time around in New Hampshire. And if you look at the ways that some of the other candidates have built inroads there, particularly Elizabeth Warren, who's coming from a neighboring state, it's going to be a far more contested space from our perspective as well. South Carolina, no doubt that Joe Biden is building up there, is trying to pull off his first big victory in that state, has gone out of his way to really just try to leverage support from the African American community in South Carolina. One key hire for him, he hired Michael McLean, who's a prominent South Carolina pastor, to sort of shore up his connections with the African American community in South Carolina. One state I haven't mentioned here is Nevada. There's not a lot of differentiation between the top 6 teams in terms of the people they're hiring and the emphasis they're making on Nevada. The one exception to that is outside of our top 6, Tom Steyer has made an extensive bid on Nevada in terms of visits, in terms of the staff he's hiring there and the campaign he's building in that state. Super Tuesday, this is really the make or break for Michael Bloomberg. As folks are no doubt tracking, he's kind of foregone even competing in the first 4 states, but he's gone out and hired staff in 30 different states. He's got people all over the place. He's heavily invested in Super Tuesday. One of the things he's done, aside from hiring the staff from Kamala Harris's campaign and Steve Bullock's campaign, is he's paying his staffers just a lot more than any other candidate is. Money has a way of talking. Something like 25 to 30% more than your average campaign staffers are receiving. And as anybody who's worked on campaigns knows, it's a tough economic field to begin with. Let's flip to the next one. Progressive advocates. Again, I think this space is a little bit more complicated than it's been in previous years. Some of the mainstream organizations that have traditionally been part of the kind of progressive advocacy bloc of the Democratic Party, think, again, environmental groups like NRDC, think social justice groups like the NAACP, others of these groups that are the traditional progressive advocates are being careful, right? And there's not a ton of their staff who are jumping out to sort of declare their open support for specific campaigns. That's very, very different when you look at the highly progressive space, the grassroots organizers, the sort of far left, more social democratic type, or democratic socialist, type space. And when it comes to competing for those more progressive advocates, it's all ultimately really a race between Bernie Sanders and Elizabeth Warren. And I would say of those two, Sanders is clearly winning. Sanders has extraordinary amounts of support from environmentalists. It's not the kind of mainstream environmentalists necessarily like NRDC and others. It tends to be the far more progressive advocates like Greenpeace, like 350.org. Of course, he's got extensive support from the labor community, although probably not nearly as tight of a lock on the labor community as he did in previous years. But one thing I would say that's helping him when you're thinking about not just the support he has, but the kind of expertise they bring to the table, is he's got a number of young activists who have serious digital acumen. So people follow the Young Turks, very compelling media platform with some serious podcast power. You look at Now This, these viral videos we've all seen that all usually try to make Republicans look bad in some way or another. There are tons of people who've worked with these organizations that are connected back to Bernie and give him that same kind of digital reach and kind of the virality we see around Bernie's campaign online. Elizabeth Warren's campaign is less about those kind of grassroots progressive activists and more about the progressive academic intellectual types. Her two strongest supporters in this space and allied institutions are Demos, the social justice and economic reform think tank here in town, as well as the Roosevelt Institute, which has been at the forefront of a lot of the push on the left to break up big tech, break up big pharma, break up whatever big industry group there is out there. When we look at the other candidates, it's just the ties are not nearly as strong. One thing that is beginning to change, and I think as we get closer to the actual primaries and ultimately to the convention, is you are starting to see some activists who are aligning with specific campaigns. So Biden has more recently hired senior organizers from World Wildlife Fund, Environmental Working Group, Next Gen Climate, Tom Steyer's old group. He has longstanding ties to groups like, Campaign for Drug-Free Kids, things of that nature. So he's starting to try to build some connections in that space, perhaps in shoring up some of the criticism he's received from the left. Mayor Pete notably has hired some senior organizers from the American Federation of Teachers, seems to be tapping into both their credentials within the labor movement as well as their organizing prowess. Oops, let's see. All right, so talking about policy, I think this is where most of us, our minds tend to go, well, what does it actually mean for policy? Who's actually surrounding them? One interesting thing about this particular race is that I think for 4 of the 6, they not only have a cadre of longtime advisors around them that they're relying on, but they've actually kind of built and cultivated a brain trust over the course of many years. So let's talk about what that means. If you look at Biden, his strongest connections are into the national security and economic policy space. No surprise, given some of his portfolio in the Senate as well as in the White House. He's cultivated that over time by setting up the Biden Institute, setting up the Penn Biden Center, and these places which are sort of overflowing with experienced policy professionals who worked with the vice president when he's in government are now being tapped for his campaign as well. He's got connections to some other kind of mainstream organizations as well, like CSIS, Center for Equitable Growth. Again, think of like the establishment Democratic organizations. Elizabeth Warren, her connections are overwhelmingly into the academic space. She's surrounded by more academic, PhD, tenured professor types than any other candidate we've studied. Some of those are kind of pure academics. Some of those are academics who've moved over to places like the Roosevelt Institute, but that's really her power base and reflects her experience as an academic. For Mayor Bloomberg, ton of connections he's bringing over, particularly from Bloomberg Philanthropies. If you think about his policy advice, it's overwhelmingly from Bloomberg Philanthropies, and those are players who focused on environment and climate change, as well as public health. And he's brought those people into his campaign. Bernie, I think a lot of people were surprised by his power in 2016. He's doubled down on that and built up kind of a brain trust in that space by setting up things like the Sanders Institute, Our Revolution, but trying to find like-minded players and have them really develop what's a philosophy that's coherent and sort of spans across Bernie's electoral appeal. The two that are a little bit weaker in this space are Senator Klobuchar, who has a number of longtime Senate staff who are around her. She has some ties to some centrist Democratic groups like Center for American Progress, like CSIS, and then Mayor Pete, who has really tried to make up for any deficit he had in this space by hiring big. He got a couple of really good early hires, people who'd been in the Obama administration at the Department of Commerce, at the Domestic Policy Council, at the Office of Social Innovation. One thing that's really interesting about Mayor Pete's strategy, and I think it's reflected here on his policy advisors, but it's really reflected more broadly in how Mayor Pete has sort of surged into the top tier of candidates, is he's just maximized every single moment of his resume. He went to Harvard with a number of people who've gone on to prominent jobs in public policy, in Silicon Valley, in finance. He did a Rhodes Scholarship with similar groups of people, but even more elite and refined. He worked at McKinsey with people who've also gone on to finance and public policy and Silicon Valley type positions. He worked at the Cohen Group. That place is chock full of foreign policy advisors and gave him a lot of early credibility in that community, not to mention the fact that he's a Navy reservist. And then as mayor, he was not going to settle himself with purely being mayor of South Bend, but actually led organizations and got actively involved in mayors associations where he could build connections with a range of others. So whereas the conventional wisdom is that a candidate will want to establish their early credentials by going all in and building a formidable ground game, for Mayor Pete, it was really going to every single entry in his career and winning over the people in that space and using some of those elite connections to sort of validate him as a serious candidate. When we mapped his campaign network early on, his kind of hardcore political operative base was very weak. That's largely been erased at this point. So he has a strong ground game. He has great political consultants. He's built up the machinery of a traditional campaign. But it started with really relying on those personal connections he built throughout his very successful but fairly young career. Finally, talking about business. So this is perhaps, again, not the year to be a pro-business Democrat. Not exactly something that everybody's running on. And I think for the purpose of this conversation, we can exclude Senator Sanders and Senator Warren from this breakdown. Of course, they've got some ties to industry despite some of their rhetoric, but it's still not nearly as strong as these other candidates. Not surprisingly, if you look at Mayor Bloomberg, he overwhelmingly has the strongest number of total connections to the business community. These are people who've been his clients and colleagues from running the Bloomberg business, but also increasingly people he's brought over to serve on the board or otherwise be involved with Bloomberg philanthropies. We've called out a couple here. Kenneth Chenault, the CEO of American Express, Bob Iger, head of Disney. But these are guys he's really relied on through the years to build up not only his business empire, but also to support his very successful time in philanthropy. If we look at Vice President Biden, just the sheer amount of years that he's been on the stage means that the government affairs community in Washington is filled with Biden alums. A couple that we've called out that are most notable where some of his alums are placed are MGM Resorts, Apple, Herbalife. There are a range of kind of more centrist progressive organizations that I talked about in previous slides that are also alums of his, but a strong number of connections to the government affairs space there. Klobuchar, strong ties to law and industry on two different fronts. One, from her time as a lawyer, she's got a number of connections to corporate law. Lawyers are her single biggest fundraiser for her campaign. And then the high turnover she's had in her office for various reasons that I don't need to explain here. She's created a fairly extensive revolving door that's given her alums prominent positions in technology and pharma in the media world. Again, Mayor Pete, fairly young candidate and youngest serious candidate ever for president, but also has a lot of old friends and colleagues from the Rhodes Scholarship, from McKinsey, from the Cohen Group. This has been part of what's driven his just incredible fundraising numbers, as he's got a real lock on fundraising out of Silicon Valley and out of the financial services sector. A number of those are people he's known throughout his career. A number of those were top bundlers for President Obama that he's been able to leverage. One interesting thing we did is we looked at the overall the mega donors of the last cycle. That's to say, we identified the top 20 donors from the Democratic side of things and mapped them out against players. So, and a couple things that jumped out that was some were surprising, some were not so. Of course, no real connections from them to Elizabeth Warren or Bernie Sanders. The single biggest recipient of support from mega donors in this cycle is Michael Bennet, overwhelmingly. Cory Booker was a huge recipient of support from these players as well. And now I think it's a big question of kind of like where do all these players, these mega donors, actually align themselves at this point. Donald Sussman, who is the single biggest supporter of Cory Booker, is not openly declared, at least not as a last check, support for another candidate. He has gotten involved with a super PAC along with a former Republican donor to try to defeat President Trump, but it's not clear where he'll actually land. So, in the final analysis, what does all this mean? Well, it's tough to say. There are a lot of different ways we can take this. The early talent gaps, as I mentioned, are largely dissipated and all have solid ground games and bases of support. As I said, Klobuchar is probably the weakest end-to-end, but I don't want to make too much of that because, again, she is doing fairly well in the polls and secured kind of that second endorsement from the New York Times, among other accolades. But I do think that whoever comes out on top will say a lot about their strategy and about the networks around them. So if it becomes about progressive activism and grassroots organizing, that overwhelmingly favors Bernie. If it's about a traditional ground game backed up by big intellectual ideas, that falls strongly to Elizabeth Warren. If it's about centrist, kind of outsider ideas and the best ground game that money can buy, that goes to Mayor Bloomberg. If it goes to return to experienced, level-headed players, that's Biden. If it's kind of the fresh, pragmatic problem solvers, the Silicon Valley can-do types, the local change makers, kind of the younger and maybe less credentialed version of the Obama team, that goes to Mayor Pete. So a lot of different ways it could shake out. We have extensive research on all these people. It goes into the details of who's actually situated around them. But at this point, I'll stop and happy to take any questions that people have. And then after that, I don't want to be the only thing standing between you and Charlie Cook. So thank you all for coming out and listening, and happy to take a couple questions. I don't know if that's good or bad. All right. Well, I'll be at the back and available to chat with anybody who wants to talk further. I'm happy to talk about different ways we're doing this work and ways we can support you, and I'm also happy to answer questions about any of the research. But again, thanks everybody for your time. Appreciate it.